The Arctic wind howled across the frozen wastes of Greenland, turning every snowflake into a sharp needle that pierced any exposed skin. Dr. Elina Carlsen stood at the helicopter window, watching the endless white silence stretch below. A world where life seemed impossible and death waited at every careless step. The Aurora research station appeared on the horizon like a mirage of civilization amidst the primordial chaos, a complex of metal domes and connecting tunnels clinging to the icy surface like a space base on an alien planet. Geothermal pipes rose skyward, emitting clouds of steam, the only sign of warmth in this frozen hell. Elina clutched a suitcase full of scientific equipment. 34 years old, a leading cryobiologist at the University of Copenhagen, she had dedicated her life to studying how plants adapt to extreme conditions. The Mars Flora project was the crowning achievement of her career, creating plant cultures that could survive in the red planet. The helicopter landed with a roar, sending up a cloud of snow dust. Elina climbed out, and the Arctic cold immediately penetrated all layers of clothing, causing her lungs to contract in shock. The temperature was minus 37 degrees Celsius, but it felt like the end of the world. "Welcome to the coldest place on Earth," a man in a red parka shouted as he approached through the snow. Dr. Henrik Olsen, project manager. Elina recognized him from photographs, a 50-year-old Norwegian with a gray beard and piercing blue eyes. But in reality, there was something more intense, fanatical about him. The look of a man obsessed with a great idea. They hurried to the station's main entrance, where they were met by the rest of the team. Dr. Ingrid Larsen, a microbiologist from Iceland, was a frail blonde with a nervous laugh. Marcus Hogland, a chemist from Norway, was a silent giant with a grim expression. 4 other scientists introduced themselves quickly, their names lost in the noise of the ventilation system. The atmosphere inside the station was amazing. Warm corridors, soft lighting, the smell of coffee and electronics. But Elina was struck by something else. The air was saturated with oxygen and had a strange, almost Swedish taste. "These are our greenhouses," Olsen explained proudly, leading her down the hall. 6 biodomes, each the size of a football field. Geothermal energy gives us unlimited heat, and a special filtration system creates the perfect atmosphere for experiments. The first greenhouse amazed Elina to the core. A real oasis stretched under a transparent dome. Rows of green plants stretched to the ceiling, leaves shimmering in artificial sunlight. Tomatoes the size of tennis balls, wheat as tall as a man, potatoes with tubers the size of a child's head. "It's incredible," she whispered. "Under these conditions, it should be impossible." "A revolutionary fertilizer of our own design," Olsen practically beamed with pride. "We have achieved results that surpass all known hydroponic methods. Plants do not just survive in extreme conditions, they thrive." Elina walked up to the nearest tomato plant. The fruits were a perfect red, the skins glistening like polished marble, but something about their appearance seemed unnatural, too perfect in shape, too intense in color, as if the plants had been pumped full of steroids. "What is the exact composition of the fertilizer?" Olsen exchanged a quick glance with Ingrid Larsen. "An organic blend of seaweed and rare minerals. Full analysis in lab notes. Study at your leisure." Elina spent the next few days studying the experimental data. The results were astonishing. The plants demonstrated frost resistance down to minus 20 degrees, survived without water for 3 months and remained viable under radiation exposure, simulating the conditions of Mars. But the deeper she delved into her research, the more questions arose. Genetic analysis showed strange mutations, changes in DNA that couldn't be explained simply by the effects of fertilizer. The plants seemed to be evolving at an incredible rate, acquiring characteristics that should have taken millennia to develop. On the 4th day, while working the night shift, Elina decided to independently study the compost department, where the miracle fertilizer was prepared. Biodome number 6 was located in the far part of the station. A narrow gallery led there, lit by dim red lamps. The compost room greeted her with a wave of heavy, cloying decomposition. Enormous vats of organic matter bubbled and steamed, creating the atmosphere of an alchemy lab. Elina put on a respirator and approached the nearest container. The mass inside was dark brown, almost black, with inclusions of white and yellow fragments. Elina took a sample for analysis and was about to leave when something flashed in the light of the flashlight. She leaned closer and felt her heart skip a beat. Among the organic remains lay a human tooth, a molar, with a gold filling, covered with the remains of decomposed tissue. Elina's hand shook as she carefully extracted the find with tweezers. It was definitely a human tooth, too large and complex for any animal. She continued searching and found more gruesome evidence: bone fragments, strands of hair, even bits of synthetic fabric. Elina collected the samples in sterile containers, trying not to think about what this find meant. In the lab, she ran a quick analysis of the soil from the compost bin. The results confirmed her worst suspicions. Extremely high levels of calcium and phosphorus, typical of decomposed human tissue. The DNA analysis took all night. Elina worked in complete silence, using portable equipment she had brought to study plant genomes. When the computer gave her the results, she felt sick. The fertilizer contained genetic material from at least 5 different people, men and women of different ages, different ethnic groups. Analysis showed that the remains had been in the soil for between 6 months and 2 years. Elina leaned back from the computer, trying to process the discovery. Her colleagues were using human remains as fertilizer for experimental plants. But where did the bodies come from? And did all of the team members know about it? She returned to her quarters and pulled out the project files. Official reports showed that 12 short-term visiting researchers had visited the station in the past 2 years. But the list of current personnel listed only 7 permanent employees. Elina began looking into the personal files of the visiting scientists. Dr. Leif Andersen, a hydroponics specialist from Denmark, arrived in March 2023, left the station early due to family reasons 2 weeks later. Dr. Kate Mackenzie, a biologist from Scotland, worked for 4 days in June 2023, then returned to the university to complete other projects. Only 5 researchers disappeared under mysterious circumstances. All were single people with no close connections, specially selected for short-term visits. All their departures coincided with periods of particularly active growth of experimental crops. Elina carefully locked the cabin door and hid the samples in her personal safe. She needed more evidence, but the picture was already horrifying. Her colleagues were killing visiting scientists and using their bodies to feed mutant plants. Something creaked behind the wall, and Elina froze. Steps in the hallway, a stop near her door, a quiet whisper. Someone was checking to see if she was asleep. That morning at breakfast, Olsen was especially friendly, asking about her impressions of her work, inquiring about her research plans. But there was something new in his eyes, a wariness, an appraising look. "How is the adaptation to our conditions going?" he asked, spreading butter on his bread. "Excellent. The experimental results are impressive. I hope you will appreciate the revolutionary nature of our approach. We are on the verge of a breakthrough that will change the future of humanity." Elina nodded, trying to appear calm. But inside, she was growing confident. She was the next target. Another guest researcher who would disappear under mysterious circumstances. That evening, she found an excuse to return to the composting room. This time, she wasn't looking for samples, but for evidence, something that could identify the victims. In the far corner of the room, she found a metal box disguised as ventilation equipment. Inside were personal items: glasses, a watch, a wedding ring, a passport in the name of Leif Andersen, a grim collection of trophies collected by methodical killers. Elina photographed the contents of the box and carefully returned everything to its place. Now she had proof, but nowhere to run. The nearest base was 200 kilometers away across the glaciers, and Olsen controlled the connection with the outside world. She was locked in an Arctic prison with a team of fanatics who had turned scientific research into a death factory. And somewhere among the experimental plants that fed on human flesh, The seeds of her own destruction grew. Elina returned to her cabin knowing that time was against her. Tomorrow or the day after, her colleagues would find an excuse to get rid of her, and her body would become fertilizer for the next harvest of miracle plants. Outside the window, the Arctic wind howled over the icy desert, but the real hell was inside, in the warm domes of the Aurora station, where science devoured humanity and life grew out of death. The Arctic night in Greenland lasted 17 hours, turning the Aurora station into an isolated island of light in the endless darkness. Elina had not slept for 2 days in a row, sitting in her cabin with samples of human remains hidden in her personal safe. The wind howled outside, a reminder that the nearest civilization was 200 kilometers away across deadly glaciers. She studied the personal files of the missing researchers, which she had managed to download from the corporate database before security blocked access. Each profile told the same sad story: lonely scientists with no close connections, brought in for short-term projects and vanished without a trace. Dr. Leif Andersen, 38, hydroponics specialist from Copenhagen. Divorced, no children, parents, deceased. Arrived at the station on March 15, 2023 to study the adaptation of root systems to low temperatures. The last entry in his work log is dated March 29th. Incredible growth results in experimental beds. Olsen promised to show the secret lab tomorrow. There was no tomorrow for Leif at Dr. Kate Mackenzie, 31, biologist from Edinburgh. Orphaned from a boarding school with a personal life of failed relationships, worked at the station for 4 days in June 2023, studying the effects of constant light on photosynthesis. Her last email to the university: colleagues here have made a breakthrough in agribiotech. They have promised to let me in on the details. It could change the future of humanity. Change, yes, but not in the way she hoped. Elina continued reading, and with each file the horror grew. 5 brilliant scientists, each an expert in their field, all of them enthusiastic, ready to contribute to the Mars colonization project, and all of them became fertilizer for mutant plants. At 4 in the morning, Elina decided to take a desperate step. She snuck into Dr. Olsen's private quarters using a service key she borrowed from the janitor. The project manager was asleep, in his cabin, and quiet snoring could be heard from the bedroom as Elina searched his office. In a locked drawer, she found Olsen's personal journal, a leather notebook covered in small, neat handwriting, the first entries dating back 2 years, when the project was just beginning. January 15, 2023. Received permission to experiment with extreme fertilizers. Traditional methods are not enough to terraform Mars. A revolutionary approach is needed. February 3, 2023. Liebig's theory of limiting growth factors applies to space farming. Plants need not only minerals but also organic memory of adaptation. Evolutionary information encoded in biomolecules. February 20, 2023. The first experiments with animal biomass showed encouraging results, but not complex enough. A more highly organized source of evolutionary memory is needed. Elina turned the page and her hands began to shake. March 10, 2023. The decision has been made. Human biomass contains millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. If plants can assimilate this information at the molecular level, they will gain the ability to adapt superfast. This is the key to survival on Mars. March 15, 2023. Leif Andersen arrives at the station. The ideal candidate, alone, without connections, completely absorbed in science. The team is ready for the first experiment. The rest of the notes evolved into a cold scientific account of how the team had drugged Andersen with drugs developed by Marcus Höglund, then used his body to create evolutionary fertilizer. Olsen described the process of decomposing tissue with specialized bacteria and incorporating the biomass into the soil with the detail of a pathologist. The results exceeded expectations. Plants grown on Andersen fertilizer demonstrate unprecedented adaptability. Tomatoes survived at 25 degrees Celsius. Potatoes yielded a harvest under radiation conditions 50 times higher than normal. Human evolutionary memory is truly transmitted to plants. Elina read on, feeling sick. Each murder was documented as a scientific experiment. Mackenzie was used to study the transfer of immunological memory. Dr. Jens Svensson, a microbiologist from Stockholm, became the subject of experiments on adaptation to space radiation. The most terrifying thing was that Olsen sincerely believed that his actions were correct. We sacrifice a few to save humanity. When Earth becomes uninhabitable, our mutant plants will ensure the survival of colonists on Mars. History will justify our methods. At the end of the diary, Elina found a list of planned experiments. Her own name was number 6, Elina Carlsen, cryobiologist, to be used to study frost resistance. Planned date, December 20th, 2024. There was less than a week left before it was used. Elina carefully returned the diary to its place and slipped out of the office. In the hallway, she ran into Dr. Ingrid Larsen, who was coming from the lab, with a tray of bacterial cultures. Elina? What are you doing here at this time? I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about the results of the experiments. Ingrid studied her face with a careful gaze. I understand. The first weeks here are always hard. Isolation affects the psyche. Do you want me to give you a sleeping pill? No, thanks. I can handle it. But as Elina walked away, she heard Ingrid take out her phone and dial a number, a quiet whisper. She was at Henrik's office. I think it's time to act. Elina locked the door to her cabin and pulled a chair up to it. Now she knew. The entire crew knew about the murders. Ingrid Larsen was developing bacteria to quickly decompose bodies. Marcus Hogland was creating drugs to painlessly euthanize victims. The other 4 scientists were assistants in this death factory. Elina opened her laptop and tried to send a message for help via satellite. The system returned an error. Access blocked by the network administrator. Olsen controlled all communications with the outside world. She tried to activate the distress beacon, but found that the security systems were also blocked. They were completely isolated from civilization, and the assassination team controlled every aspect of life on the station. Elina went to the window and looked at the icy desert beyond the glass. The nearest base was 200 kilometers away, through inaccessible glaciers. With temperatures of -40 and constant snowstorms, an attempt to escape was tantamount to suicide. But staying also meant death. At 7 in the morning, she was awakened by a knock on the door. Olsen's voice, unusually friendly. Elina, breakfast is ready. We would like to discuss the results of your research with you. She got dressed and went out into the common dining room, where the entire team was already sitting at the table. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was smiling too widely, too artificially. We decided to let you in on the details of our project, Olsen said, pouring coffee. You've worked here long enough to understand the importance of our mission. Elina sat down carefully, keeping her hands in sight. She noticed that Marcus Haugland was sitting next to her with a small medical bag. What details exactly? A methodology for creating a revolutionary fertilizer. A source of evolutionary memory that makes our plants capable of super-adaptation. Ingrid Larsen leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a fanatical gleam. We use human biomass, Elina. It's the only way to pass on to plants millions of years of our species' adaptive experience. You kill people. We're saving humanity, Olsen replied, calmly. Every sacrifice is an investment in the future of our species. When Earth becomes uninhabitable, the colonists of Mars will thank us. Elina slowly moved away from the table. You are all sick. We are the visionaries. Marcus Hogland opened his medical bag and pulled out a syringe. And you will be part of a great project. Your death will give life to plants that will feed millions of colonists. Elina jumped up and ran to the exit, but the door locked with an electronic click. The station's security system was working against her. Don't resist, Olsen said softly. The drug works quickly and painlessly. You won't even feel the transition. But Elina wasn't about to give in. She grabbed a thermos of hot coffee and threw it in Hogland's face, then smashed the glass door of the fire cabinet and activated the emergency siren. A deafening howl filled the station. Red lights flashed throughout the corridors. In the chaos, Elina ran out of the cafeteria and rushed to the greenhouses, the only place where she could hide and use her knowledge of botany to her advantage. Behind them, they heard the shouts of the crew, the stamping of feet, Olsen's orders to block all exits. But Elina knew the station better than they thought. She made her way into biodome number 3 through the service tunnel and locked herself among the mutant plants. Here, in an artificial oasis of life, surrounded by the fruits of scientific madness, Elina began to plot her revenge. If Olsen and his team wanted to use plants as weapons, she would show them that a true botanist could turn their creations against their creators. The Arctic night was gathering over the Aurora station, but in the greenhouses a hunt had begun, not for a defenseless victim, but for a team of killers who had underestimated the power of nature in the hands of someone who understood its laws. The final battle for survival has begun among plants, fed on human blood. The endless Arctic night had fallen like a shroud over Aurora station, enveloping the metal domes in a darkness that seemed to seep through the walls and creep into every corner. Elina Carlsen sat among the mutant plants in Biodome 3, feeling the cold seeping into her bones despite the artificial warmth of the greenhouse. The alarm had gone off an hour ago, but the red lights continued to flicker, turning the green foliage into bloody shadows. She knew the assassination team was looking for her. She heard their footsteps in the corridors, their muffled voices the creaking of metal under the weight of bodies. Dr. Henrik Olsen and his fanatics would not leave her alive. She knew too much about their bloody project. But Elina was no longer a helpless victim. Over the night among the plants fed on human flesh, she had understood their true nature. The mutants weren't just hyper-adapted cultures. They were living archives of human agony, having absorbed the final moments of the 5 murdered scientists. Their cellular structure held not only nutrients, but something darker, a molecular memory of fear, pain, and despair. Elina walked up to a human-sized tomato plant. The fruits pulsed in the red light of the emergency lighting like giant hearts. She reached out and touched one. The surface was warm, almost hot, and something was moving beneath the skin. Not juice, but something thicker, more alive. At that moment, the door to the biodome swung open and Olsen's team walked in. The 5 remaining assassins surrounded her, holding medical instruments instead of weapons. Syringes, scalpels, surgical clamps. They were going to cut her up alive like a lab animal. Elina, Olsen's voice was soft, almost soothing. You've forced us to change our plans. We were going to give you a painless death, but now we're going to have to get the most data out of the dying process. Dr. Ingrid Larsen held a clear container of wriggling microorganisms. My bacteria will break down your tissues slowly, giving the plants time to fully absorb the nutrients. You will be alive and conscious for several hours. Marcus Höglund prepared a whole set of drugs, not for putting to sleep, but to maintain the victim's consciousness during the agony. Fear and pain enrich the biomass with adrenaline and other stress hormones. Plants that feed on such an environment become even more resilient. Elina slowly retreated between the rows of plants, feeling the leaves touch her skin. But instead of fear, she felt a strange connection with the mutants. They recognized her not as an enemy, but as an ally. You don't realize what you've created, she said, stopping at the largest potato plant. These aren't plants anymore. They're something else. Olsen laughed. Of course they are different. They have evolved in 2 years to a level that would have taken nature millions of years. They are perfect. They are hungry. Elina took a lab knife out of her pocket and made a cut on her palm. Blood dripped onto the soil near the roots of the potato. The reaction was instantaneous. The roots crawled out of the ground like living snakes reaching for the source of the blood. See? Elina stepped back, letting the roots follow the drops of blood. They're no longer content with dead biomass. They want living flesh. Höglund tried to back away, but the roots had already reached his feet. Thick, fleshy tendrils wrapped around his ankles and began to pull him toward themselves. The chemist screamed, trying to free himself, but the plant was stronger. Help me! He cried out to his colleagues, but they were too shocked by what was happening. The potato roots pierced Höglund's boots and dug into his flesh. His screams echoed throughout the biodome, but the plant continued to suck him in, The skin on the chemist's legs began to turn gray and wrinkle. The mutant was sucking out not only blood, but also life juices. Ingrid Larsen tried to escape, but the tomatoes reacted to the movement. The giant fruits burst, releasing a cloud of spores and acidic juice. The microbiologist suffocated as the spores entered her lungs and the acid began to eat away at her skin. "That's impossible," Olsen shouted, retreating toward the exit. "Plants can't—" "They can," Elina interrupted, "when human blood flows through them, when they remember what it means to be a predator." The wheat was next to come alive. The tall stalks bowed like the heads of giant snakes, and the ears split open to reveal rows of sharp teeth where the grains had been. Olsen's 2 remaining assistants were torn to pieces in seconds, the stalks of wheat working like razor-edged whips. Olsen was left alone, his back pressed against the glass wall of the biodome. His eyes showed the horror of a man who had created a monster and only now realized his mistake. "You don't understand," he shouted at Elina. "Without these plants, humanity won't survive on Mars. The colonists will die of hunger. Then let them find another way," she replied coldly. "Without killing." The plants slowly surrounded Olsen like a pack of predators. The roots of the potatoes, still digesting Hogland's remains, reached out toward the project manager. The tomatoes swelled with juice, preparing for another burst of acid. The wheat swayed in anticipation. "Elina, please." Olsen fell to his knees. "I can change everything. We'll find an ethical way." But it was too late. The mutant plants had sensed his fear, and fear was a drug for them. They attacked their creator with a fury that surpassed any natural instinct, revenge for being turned into a murder weapon. Olsen disappeared into a green mass of roots, stems, and leaves, his last cry cut off by a gurgling sound as the roots sank into his throat. Elina stood in the middle of the bloody greenhouse, the only survivor of the battle between the creators and their creations. The plants no longer moved. They were sated, having received what they had been craving since their twisted birth. But the victory had its price. The biodome was destroyed, the life support systems were damaged. Elina felt the temperature slowly drop. The geothermal pipes were torn apart by the mutant's roots. She made her way to the emergency transmitter and sent out a distress signal. The rescue team would come, but would find only ruins and the official version of a technical failure. While gathering her personal belongings, Elina noticed several seeds dropped by the mutants. Her scientist instincts compelled her to pick them up, samples of a unique life form that could revolutionize agriculture if used correctly. A week later, she was found in the wreckage of the station. Elina told rescuers about the explosion in the lab, the fire, the panic. No one went into detail. All the evidence had burned or was buried under tons of ice. Back in Copenhagen, Elina found mutant seeds sprouting in her apartment. The little sprouts were drawn to her like pets, feeding on dead flies and scraps of food. They were calm, almost tame, perhaps because they remembered her as an ally. Elina faced a choice. In her hands was technology that could feed millions of starving people. But this same technology was born of blood and death. Can the fruits of evil be used for good deeds? She created a new laboratory in the basement of her home, a top-secret one. No one was to know about her experiments with the descendants of the Arctic mutants. But every night while working with the plants, she heard whispers, the voices of Leif Anderson, Kate Mackenzie, and other victims, forever trapped in the mutants' cellular memory. They asked not for revenge, but for justice. They asked that their deaths not be in vain. Elina continued her experiments, but in a different way, without killing, without fanaticism, with respect for life. Slowly, painfully slowly, she learned to extract the beneficial properties of mutants without feeding them human flesh. But on the darkest nights, when work was not going on and the plants were moving restlessly in their pots, Elina wondered if the darkness of their creators was being passed on along with the seeds. Did it not carry the seeds of a new evil that would one day sprout and demand new victims? Outside the window, Copenhagen slept peacefully, unaware that in the basement of one of the houses the airs of the Arctic hell were growing. plants that remember the taste of human blood and are waiting for their time. Elina worked until dawn, knowing that her war against the darkness of science would never end. She became a guardian of dangerous knowledge, the last barrier between civilization and the horror that good intentions without ethical boundaries can create. In the desk drawer was a photograph of the Aurora crew, 7 smiling scientists ready to change the world. But the world changed them first, turning them into monsters for whom human life was just fertilizer. Elina turned off the light in the lab and went up to her apartment. Dawn was breaking outside, but in her soul, there was an eternal Arctic night. The memory of the place where she learned that the most terrible monsters wear the faces of scientists and hide behind noble goals. Darkness never dies. It only waits for a new gardener.